A very warm welcome to all who have gathered here for a 3-day international conference on disability and inclusion organized by Bhumika Trust in collaboration with Hansraj College and Center for Disabilities, Gujarat National Law University. Before we start the session, you all are requested to listen and adhere to the rules, which are attendees need to rename to their original names as registered. They need to be on mute. No attendee is allowed to unmute their mic to speak unless asked to do so. If still it is done once, a warning will be given, and other time he would be removed from the meeting and won't be allowed to enter on any terms and conditions. Attendees can on their videos if they want. Attendees can type in chat box for any questions or issues. The agenda for today's session is disability rights and advocacy, and we are obliged by the presence of various keynote speakers, which are Dr. Sanjay Jain, Ms. Sudamini Peter, Ms. Rama Krishnamachari, Dr. Nikhil Jain. Now, inviting Dr. Sanjay Jain, I would like to brief you all about him. Presently, he holds additional charge as Principal ILS Law College, Pune, India. He is a disability rights activist and also taken keen interest in social theory and comparative public law. Amongst his publications, most prominent is Basic Structure Constitutionalism, Revisiting Keswender Bharati ED, Dr. Sanjay Jain and Satya Narayan EBC 2011 recently. His scholarship has been cited by the Supreme Court of India in Vikas Kumar versus Union of India. He also have experience of policy formation and legislative drafting at both state and national level, and also have received President Award as the most efficient disabled employee from Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam. So now over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for such a wonderful introduction. I hope my voice is audible.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay. So friends, after lunch, any session is very challenging. But coincidentally, the topic of this session is very interesting. And this topic is important because, when we talk about the rights of disabled, we have to challenge many things. So although the session is challenging, hopefully you will all appreciate the challenges in the way of exercise and enjoyment of rights by persons with disabilities. There is this debate. Recently I was looking at some literature, and there is this debate whether people with disability can do well with rights, or should they be allowed the freedoms. In other words, whether rights regime is more effective than freedoms or vice versa. In my opinion, it would be hair-splitting distinction to argue that there is a difference between rights and freedoms. Of course, one may argue about the procedural aspects of enforcement of right. What if the procedural technicalities are if the exercise of rights is fraught by procedural technicalities, then of course one can complain about the effectiveness of rights. But I think then it would not be a problem with rights, but it would be a problem with the procedure associated with the enforcement of rights. So in the context of disabled, what kind of framework of rights we expect, and what kind of procedure should be there for its effective enforcement? So in my opinion, there are three important key elements which should be there, both as part of procedure as well as substance, when we talk about the effective exercise of rights by the disabled. So what are those three key elements? Firstly, there should be there should be the mechanism to avail reasonable accommodation. Because reasonable accommodation is a very important enabler. It allows both the parties, both disabled and non-disabled, to tailor themselves in a given environment. Non-disabled can try and make certain structural adjustments within reasonable limits, and disabled can enter into an active dialogue with non-disabled to help the latter to develop such structural adjustment. So reasonable accommodation is the first element, and reasonable accommodation is important. Why it is important? Reasonable accommodation is important because uh, uh, reasonable accommodation is important because no matter how, no matter what you do, it is not possible to have a level playing field. It is very difficult to create a level playing field, and therefore, because there is no level playing field, in absence of level playing field, you need to respond to the individual needs, special needs of a particular individual, and therefore reasonable accommodation is a key. Then the second element is universal design. The second element, when things or products are designed, our reference point is able-bodied. Our reference point is majority. Our reference point is those who use a particular product the most. But when we do so, do we not ignore or overlook minorities? Do we not ignore or overlook certain atypicalities? Why we should assume that only typical people will use a particular product, right? Once we make our canvas inclusive, and once we make it a point to ensure that we should cater to everyone, irrespective of his or her diversity, his or her difference, then our approach becomes very accommodative. Our approach becomes very inclusive, and our design also becomes much more acceptable, much more workable. Bulk of the. Again, when I say this, when I talk about universal design, I'm acutely aware of the fact that there cannot be any device, there cannot be any structure which would be congenial, which will be conducive to both orthopedically handicapped and totally blind. For example, a wheelchair-bound person may not find it comfortable to use his chair in a tactile environment, right? Therefore, universal design does not mean similar design, but universal design means a design which would enable most of us in some way or the other, in terms of degrees, to have our needs and situations addressed. Then the third important aspect of rights, it should be the part of the procedure as well as substance, is the accessibility. Now, accessibility means what? Accessibility means access, and access means access without barriers. Because if you give access, but if you create a lot of barriers or inhibitions or hindrances, then it would not be access. It would be only the lip service to the idea of access. So, for example, when you say that, okay, under Indian Constitution, every citizen has right to freedom of movement, but can freedom of movement be a real right to a person with disability? Be she or an orthopedical handicapped, or be she a person with visual impairment. Suppose if the roads are full of barriers, suppose if roads are not properly there is no access audit of roads, and there is no tactiling, right? Or there is no effective solution for addressing the needs of the people on wheelchair, etc. So therefore, accessibility and universal design, they are connected with each other. Again, when we talk about accessibility, our understanding of barriers must be very clear. If you argue that steps on to climb to reach a house, they are not barriers, but they are the part of the structure. They are routine part of the structure. Then probably you are trying to take a position that without steps a building cannot be constructed, or if a building is constructed without steps, it will be an incomplete building, because you don't want to explore the alternatives of steps. And therefore, a famous disability rights activist, he very picturesquely puts his point, saying, when I look at stairs, I'm always reminded of my valleys. I'm always reminded how vulnerable I am, so that I'm not able to reach a particular building. Because I'm repeatedly reminded that without climbing the steps, you cannot reach the destination, as if climbing the steps is such a big deal. Whereas if you try and explore the possibility of having a ramp nearby steps, you make a marked difference. So accessibility, friends, is a real enabler, because by creating accessibility, by fostering universal design, and by having a very robust, reasonable accommodation policy, what we have created is, to borrow the terminology of my late teacher, Dr. Deshpande, then you have created rights enabling conditions. Amartya Sen used to say very picturesquely, he used to argue that if you confer rights, but if the conferment of the rights is contingent on, just a minute, hello, you meeting मध्ये होतो, नाही नाही दुसरी, नाही. So I'm sorry, I was telling you about I was telling you about universal design. So what effective reasonable accommodation policy, how it may be, these are how these three elements are enablers. Now let me say that suppose you have accessibility, you have I was on sorry, Amartya Sen. And Amartya Sen very clearly stated that if you give rights, you confer rights on people, but if you subject these rights to such conditions that it is impossible for the people to exercise rights, so you confine the scope of rights by creating conditions which are impossible to attain. So you say you have a right to walk, but there are barriers. You say you have right to receive education, but the classes are on the 5th floor and there is no facility of ramps, right? So therefore, Amartya Sen's idea that rather than freedoms, we have to eliminate unfreedoms. So there are a lot of unfreedoms. Freedoms are dominated by unfreedoms. So you have a school, but there is no resource teacher, and a person with disabilities going to school is then completely futile. It is an exercise in futility. So similarly, Martha Nussbaum, when she tries to develop her capability approach, she argues that we have to instill certain capabilities in every individual, irrespective of whether he is typical or atypical, because she regards certain capabilities central to every person. So, for example, capability, one of the capabilities is my ability to make friends, my ability to recreate, go for recreation, my ability to, go to school, etc., etc. So there's lots of associated functionalities, which would depend, which would make or unmake you as a capable person. So my capability as a student depends on what machinery state has put in place to ensure that I'm able to take education, I'm able to reach school, I'm able to have my hands on the course material, whether the course material is in accessible format. So clearly, therefore, these three enablers are essential. Without these three enablers, if you give rights to people with disabilities, then such rights will be useless. Then these are the three instrumental enablers. Then there are some substantive enablers according to. So what are the substantive enabler rights? Firstly, right to education. If you don't educate yourself, epistemologically, education leads to freedom. Education leads to acquisition of knowledge. So if you don't educate yourself, opposite of education is complete abysmality. You are beyond yourself. You are beyond the society. Therefore, right to education is another enabler. But unfortunately, again, when we talk about right to education in India, we basically focus on the primary and the secondary education. There is hardly any focus on university education. Apart from a provision reserving 5% post seats in educational institutions, there is hardly any provision in RPWD Act fostering opportunities for the PWDs to pursue higher education. UGC has also focused on creation of equal opportunity come enabling cells. UGC also provides funding for the establishment of such cells. But again, there is hardly any awareness about such cells. And we know that, very few colleges in India have established such cells. In my opinion, it is important that not only the higher education of PWDs must be focused, but it should be also ensured that PWDs do not remain mere stakeholders. PWDs do not simply remain as recipients of higher education. They should be the part of the each and every aspect of higher education. So, for example, there should be disabled teachers. Disabled people should be the part of the management of the institutions. They should be the part of the administration of the system. So, in order to have a spillover effect of the productivity of the disabled people, it is important that we ensure their participation in every aspect of the higher education. Then another important enabler, substantive enabler, is right to employment. Okay, I am educated, I have earned degree, I have acquired degree, but what if my degree is not respected, my degree is not valued, if I am repeatedly undermined? For example, most of the times, and it is very often a reality, if you go for any interview and if you are a person with disability, first the body will target your disability. They will not first try and find out your potential, but first they will try and find out how can they target you. For example, Supreme Court also says that a very notorious observation in my opinion, in Devendra Kumar Pant's case, Supreme Court held that Rights of Persons with Disability Act is a helping hand, but it is not a law which should be used by the people with disability to jeopardize the lives of their fellow citizens. I fail to understand how people with disabilities can jeopardize the lives of the fellow citizens. The lives of the fellow citizens may be jeopardized only because by default, the societal structures are ableist. Now, you don't want to challenge the ableist structures. You don't want to dismantle the ableist structure. You don't want to problematize the ableist structure. And you want people with disability to fit in such structures which are deeply tilted, which are totally tilted in favor of typical people. So naturally, there are bound to be skirmishes. There are bound to be ruptures. But these ruptures and skirmishes are not because of the disabled, but they are because of your faulty system. And you cannot rectify everything by retrofitting. Retrofitting is possible only in some respects. But if your design is deeply problematic, if it is exclusively towards the benefits of the non-disabled, then I don't think there is any point in quibbling about dismantlement of such design. For example, the myth that blind people cannot do administration. This is a normal myth which is entertained around the world, right, including in India. The reason assigned is okay because they cannot see. My question is, if administration can be done by, let's try and explore this point. Let's try and find out the truth in the argument. Assuming for the sake of argument that blind people are not good administrators because they cannot see. Bulk of the administration is done by sighted people. So whether the administration is efficient, whether sighted people do not make any mistakes while performing administrative duties. In fact, given the absence of blind people from the arena of administration and knowing the lapses, administrative lapses in India, it is very clear that sighted people are at least as inefficient as blind people, if not more. Therefore, to attach undue importance to sight and then say that a person with disability, like particularly a person with visual impairment, cannot do administration, I think, is a stigmatized assumption. You are attaching stigma to a want in me, and then using the stigmatized image of mine to deny me a particular role. In my opinion, if blind people find it difficult to administer, it is because of the faulty structure. Are you providing them reasonable accommodation? Have you provided them assistance? Whether your work environment is enabled so that if a blind person wants to instruct or inspect any particular premises, he can or she can do it easily? No. In fact, it is also possible to argue that if a blind person is not able to sign, if he is not able to put his signature, he may be held disqualified from holding a particular position. So, what is a big deal in not signing? Can there not be an alternative to signature? We have now, electronic signature. So my point is, friends, it's easy to read charters of human rights. It's easy to say that RPWD Act has given this right, that right. But I think what we miss most of the times is the fact that whether we have enabled the enablers. And therefore, I wanted to focus today on rights enabling conditions. Therefore, I wanted to focus today on instilling capabilities. Because in my opinion, till you make a person capable enough, till you create adequate conditions around a particular person, no matter how many rights you confer on him, such rights would be futile. So I would like to cite a case and then I will stop. The case is, Vikash Kumar versus Union of India. It is a very positive judgment. Therefore, I would like to cite this case. And by the way, this case I am citing because my article was cited by Justice Chandrachud in this case. Now, Vikash Kumar involved a very interesting question, whether a person with some problem in his hands, in his hand by which he writes, can he be denied the services of a scribe? Now, the usual argument of the Hisapita, usual argument of the government was, okay, in order to avail the services of a writer, you should have 40% disability. Whereas, if you carefully look at our law now makes a very, very clear distinction between persons with disability and persons with benchmark disability. Only when you claim certain entitlements which are exclusively conferred on persons with benchmark disability, your disability has to be 40% or more. Or if it is not, if you have a kind of disability which cannot be described in measurable terms, then as per the statute, you should be a qualified person with disability. But otherwise than for availing certain special benefits in chapters 6 and 7 of Persons with Disabilities Act. So far as other human rights, including the right against non-discrimination is concerned, there is no requirement of any threshold. For example, can a hotelier exclude you or ask you to leave his hotel on the ground that you are disabled, even though your disability is 20%, it is not 40%? The answer is clearly no, because only with regard to certain entitlements and benefits, the requirement of threshold is there. But otherwise, even if your disability is negligible, your disability is not visible, you are entitled to enjoy your human rights. Same point was highlighted by Justice D.Y. Chandrachud. He very clearly argued that it is ill-advised to collapse a carefully drawn distinction by the legislature between person with disability and persons with mental disability. He observed that so far as former are concerned, they are entitled to every human rights. Only in respect of certain benefits, which have to be prioritized because of the scarcity of resources, priority will be given to the people with benchmark disability. So the moral of the story is that just keep in mind that every human being has inherent dignity. No human being is lesser. No human being is lesser important than you. Once we realize that disability is merely the part of human diversity, once we realize that disability is one of those differences which are normal, once we realize that disability is not to be looked at with prejudice as a natural difference, thereby deserving discriminatory treatment, I think we would make this world a better place. We would make our society a more equal society. It is said that non-disabled people do not understand disabled. I would argue that it's both ways. Sometimes disabled also do not understand non-disabled. And sometimes one category of disabled persons do not understand the people with disabilities falling in some other categories. So, friends, let us challenge this dichotomy of disability and non-disability. In my opinion, all of us are disabled. Only difference between my disability and the disability of my typical friend is that his disability, being the disability prevalent amongst majority, is remedied, is properly responded to, and therefore he does not feel or she does not feel the crunch of it. Whereas my disability, being a disability faced by a minority and having not been properly addressed, I feel the crunch about it, right? For example, there was a time when even if your eyes have cataract, you will become blind because there was hardly any treatment available. But now cataract is such a normal thing that if somebody says that, okay, I have a cataract, therefore I have become disabled, people will laugh at it. Friends, with this, I would like to conclude. While concluding, let me say still that disability studies is a very complex subject. Still, there are poignant questions like whether disability is a good difference, is it a bad difference, or is it a neutral difference? Whether is it okay to voluntarily cause disability to one's body so as to celebrate disability? uh, whether state should provide benefits to only such persons with disabilities whose disability is acquired by birth, or those disabled people who take treatment. For example, what if I refuse to take treatment to cure my disability? Should the state then object, saying that, okay, now as you have not taken treatment, will not provide you facilities? There are many issues associated with definition of disabilities. I think the perennial problem is uh, the so-called non-disabled, they don't regard themselves as disabled. Once everybody starts regarding oneself as disabled, maybe not in every aspect, in some aspect. For example, not knowing English may itself be a disability, right? Not able to drive a scooter may itself be a disability. So, uh, friends, let's try and challenge this dichotomy between disabled and disabled. Let's try and remove the stigma associated with disability. Once everybody starts feeling oneself disabled, this whole idea of discriminating with people with disability vanish. Let me thank Raghav for inviting me and giving this opportunity to interact with you. Let me wish all of you a very happy Disabled Day on the eve of Disabled Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanjay Jain. We really loved listening to you, and the way you told that everyone is disabled. The conclusion was that everyone is disabled. We really, I totally agree with that point, and that was such a wonderful talk by you, sir. Thank you so much. Now, moving on to our next speaker. I would like the sign language interpreters, Preeti ji and Atul ji, to be ready. So our next speaker is very special. She is Sudamini Peter.
So talking about Miss Sudamini Peter, she is a prominent feminist role model actively involved in supporting deaf women across the country. She is the first deaf law student from the country and is a pioneer in making legal awareness accessible to deaf women. She organized, along with other lawyers, a 12-part series for deaf women last year, 2020, demystifying various laws and legal procedures. Sudamini is an avid reader, loves to travel, and watch movies in her free time. Welcome you, ma'am.
She just wants to say thanks to Jayan and the other organization team to give her an opportunity to become the panelist of this session. जैसे कि पहले स्पीकर्स ने बोला उनके बारे में she also cared about and she really feel कि this is really a truth. On the same point, she also add on something. Because of when we say the person with disability, when we're talking about the person with disability, the law is very important for us. Can you give me some second, please?
Sorry for interruptions. So now I can see both interpreter. So as I can say, in the society we have personal challenges also, and we are dependent the peoples like accommodation. If we'll say accommodation, we really need it. We really needed the accommodation, like basic accommodation. We can say disability or non-disability. It called an inclusion. It's quite difficult because since the beginning, as we can see, there's a non-disabled people is a big. They have a big community, and disabled people they have very small community. Uh, After that, we will explain related to the jobs, anything like. For example, I am deaf. Okay, if I wanna discuss with them, I wanna ask any questions because they are non-disabled or disabled, but there is not a similarity in both community. There is a lots of challenges for us. This is my own experience. I'm sharing with you, and plus I observe in the society. It is long back. K Karma. Karma.
Karma.
Okay, karma. If disabled people, they have different point of view to, for example, person with disability. Okay, 1995, and we can see that they are dependent on the medicals conditions. They dependent, but non-disabled people, they are not dependent. For example, disabled people, doctors are fixing their disability with the like medical treatment, with anything kind of things. So as I can see, ki doctors, so Person with Disability Act 2016, right? So person with disability, when it started, then we have seen our society point of view. It's a better because rights, there is a some rights that has changed in that act. So it's a better act. So what's the problem with disability and non-disability? Because the RPWD Act has made the equality for everyone, and they started to observe in the society. So it's a good for us, and it's a Pritibam hers. I think video is blurring. I'm it's from my side. I think so. Connectivity issue maybe.
Yeah, that's it. Huh. When we're talking about the employment, the earlier people thinking this is only the charity, also equal opportunity. They are selecting the deaf people there, but they're not giving any work, just about the salary. So these are the questions when we get stuck on this. And the people get doubted to, interact with us, to communicate with us. And now we are talking about education, right to education earlier that Sir has said. See, when we are talking about the right to education, the deaf person is taking a classes in the classroom, but the teacher is teaching through the writing way or by the oral. So we are requesting to provide the sign language interpreter through the training during the classes. So these are our rights. So they should provide these services to us. So they should break the barriers and give us a equal opportunity. So deafness is not a disability. But the society has given us a barrier to give us a less opportunities. So at the age of 9, she become a deaf. She's just sharing her experience. So that time she faced lots of issues. In the disability law, the lots of laws are not in a favorable of the deaf people. The teachers are not using the sign language. Our parents doesn't know the sign language. at the age of 18, then I just get to realize the sign language is required for us, and this is our right. And now people are, forcing everyone to be a cognate plan, cochlear plan. The doctors are suggesting everyone for the cochlear plan. But in this case, some, it's not always a past scenario. Sometimes it gets failed. It's not suits on all the deaf people, for all disabled. So we have to give them what exactly the person required. If the person wants to use the sign language, so we should provide the sign language to the person, allow them to sign. And some are hard of hearing. They don't prefer sign language. They prefer captioning. So captioning is also important. So it depends on the requirement of the person, requirement of the deaf person or the hard of hearing person. So we have to give them a reasonable accommodation according to the need. She's just going to type something. Just wait for a moment. Still over. Means that disabled people should be inclusive in all the policies, in accessibility, in acts, in anything. Because all the disabilities are not same. Everyone, all the disabilities have their own issues, their own barriers, which the other disability or the non-disabled person will not understand. So when you make any act of policy, the deaf person should be included. All the disability people should be included. And then we will understand what are the issues and what are the solutions for that deaf people. Right now in India, if you can see, lots of people are using the oralism, and the sign language is not much better. And the growth of sign language is still very slow. In a court, in a law, everywhere is here, but the sign language is here. But still, if you can see around, you will not find the sign language much accessible in much accessible mode. We have given a letter to the Prime Minister and waiting for to recognize the sign language as to recognize our sign language as a one of the language. This is very important for us if the sign language become the official language. So how can we read the material? How will we understand the material? For the hearing people, it's quite easy to listen from anywhere and they will understand. But what about us? How will we get to know? So this is the reason I'm just telling you all these things. We want to resolve it. We want a solution for this. So that's why we're just requesting whenever we're making any policy, anything, we're just requesting to include the disabled people, person with disabilities. We want to learn, we want to share, and we want inclusion. Thank you so much. That's it.
Thank you, ma'am. We are very much enlightened by the words you spoke, and we have increased our knowledge
Thank you.
by the uh, concepts of your disability. Now, I would like to invite Ms. Ramakrishnan Rari. She has more than 2 decades of work experience in the field of disability inclusion and equality. She has specialized in the area of disability policy and has undertaken several studies on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its application in various aspects. She has developed the Disability Inclusion Framework for employment in the corporate sector, which has been recognized nationally and internationally. She led the development of HR manual called Values Route to Business Success, the Why and How of Employing People with Disabilities in 2007, which was published by Confederation of Indian Industry CII. It is a reference book being used by NGOs and corporate sector. She has developed training modules and conducted several trainings in the area of disability for different stakeholder groups. She is a trusted advisor to many organizations and diversity professionals. Now over to you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. After such good presentation by Dr. Sanjay Jain and Sudamini regarding the disability rights, I really have not many points because I do not want to repeat what has already been said about disability rights. I may kind of, I jotted down few points that, may be relevant. So I'll only speak about those aspects, and I'll be happy to, when the session opens up for questions for everyone, maybe we could add more based on our experiences. So talking about the disability, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016, I think a lot was covered about non-discrimination, reasonable accommodation, universal design. The few things that I've pointed out is that this act also applies to the private sector. So which 1995 act did not really apply to the private sector. It only applied to the government sector, the employment or accessibility related clauses. Whereas this particular act specifically mentions private sector in the establishment. It says both private and public sector. Then there was this question about public building. So earlier understanding of a public building was that it was a government owned building, whereas this particular act has very clearly said public building is, the definition is that the building that is largely used by the public. It includes commercial spaces, it includes workspaces. Even though if it is owned privately, it will come under the definition of public building. Similarly, public services. Again, it kind of expands the definition to any service used by public at large, even those which are owned privately. This covers everything: banking, transportation, religious services, all kinds of e-commerce, everything is covered. Another, and of course, for employers, private establishments and public establishment, this particular law has very specific things for establishments to do. It says, have an equal opportunity, frame an equal opportunity policy specific to persons with disabilities. Earlier, corporates and others would just do an overall diversity policy or a EO policy covering everybody. Now it says you have to have a policy specific for people with disabilities, where you will have to list down the different things that you will do, including having a grievance redressal mechanism, including the reasonable accommodation, everything, including who is a liaison officer. So every establishment should appoint a liaison officer who is supposed to look at the accommodations, the facilities that a person with disability needs. So in that sense, it puts the onus on the employers. In fact, every employee doesn't say that those who employ, so and so, or those who employ so, they should have a more larger kind of an equal opportunity policy, but every establishment. Again, establishment is not just the larger corporate firm, also the NGOs are covered here. any kind of NGO, not just disability, all NGOs are covered here. So these are some of the very specific things that the private sector is required to do under the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act. It's another matter. I'll come to implementation, how well it is being implemented and not implemented. The second important thing is the timelines. This particular act speaks about, services being accessible by 2019, 2 years ago. Built environment should become accessible by 2022, June 2022, which is like next year. But unfortunately, even today, most services remain inaccessible, whether it is even the hospitals that you go to or any e-commerce site, the banking sites, all of these, many of them remain inaccessible. And there's been very little intervention that has happened, by the disability sector to really make some of these service providers accountable. Yes, there's a deadline for the buildings is coming. I don't know how many establishments are even aware of this deadline. There has been very little action, I would say, from the government to really enforce. Have they sent notices? Have they kind of taken any step to even create awareness among the stakeholders regarding the provisions in the Act? So largely, even though it's been 5 years now, most provisions remain just on paper and it is not being implemented. There has been very little awareness on this issue. I'll also talk about the fact that the benchmark disability has been expanded to cover 21 categories. Some of those, like, for example, in the employment in the 1995, only had 3 categories of disability. Here now, RPWD Act has intellectual disabilities, people with autism, people with mental illness. All of these people can also avail of reservation. The question now is that we should find out that how many people with intellectual disabilities have been appointed in the government sector. There is 1% reservation. How many people with mental illness have got appointed in the... So again, the good thing is that it's expanded. Now people with intellectual disabilities have right to reservation, right to employment. But what is it being done to enforce it? So what else is there? Legal capacity. Another very important aspect in this law is that people with disabilities have legal capacity. Many people, some people would be aware of, I don't know the kind of group that is here, but many people are not even aware of the fact that people with certain disabilities did not have legal capacity. They could not open a bank account. They had to always bring a guardian. They couldn't sign any contract because they had to bring in a guardian. So guardianship was the regime, and guardians were appointed who will take all decisions on your behalf. So people with intellectual disabilities or people with psychosocial disabilities did not even have the right to do any decision making on their own. What was called a substituted kind of a decision making, someone else would make the decision. This particular law very clearly says every person has the legal capacity and can make their own decisions. However, of course, some people will need support to make decision. So supported decision making. So support should be provided to make the decision. So this is a very important thing, particularly for people with psychosocial disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, who can, even change the guardian if they like, because sometimes guardians can be the problem. So they can change the guardians or change the person support. I won't say the word guardian. It's actually the support person. So some of these provisions are very positive in this act for people with disabilities. Plus, there is also penalties and punishments mentioned in this act, which is also a good thing. I don't know how much has been used by the courts to punish people. Today, we are, in spite of so many years, 1995 Act came, that itself was 50 years after the independence. Now it's 20 more years have gone by. We have a 2016 Act. Yet, if you really look at, people are still asking for very basic thing, basic rights, like, access to classroom, what Sudamini said. If they want to just attend a classroom, I mean, that's the state of affair that we are in. Even the basic facilities are not available for people with disabilities. And even for this, I don't know why they have to go to Supreme Court, and yet there are hardly any sign language interpreters in colleges for people with disabilities. And I don't understand why sign language is not being recognized as a national language in spite of, their fighting. So you could imagine when we say all of us are disabled, we are not. So let's acknowledge that. I don't think Dr. Sanjay meant that at all, but I think that was understood like that. Actually, one should understand that even the basics are not available for people with disabilities even today. We have done some progress, but it's still a very, very long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your wonderful insight. It was a pleasure listening to you. Now I invite the next speaker. Dr. Nikhil Jain is currently working as an associate professor in Department of Political Science of Dayal Singh College, University of Delhi. He has been teaching since 2001. He has written various research papers on disabilities rights. Also, he has attended numerous number of state and national level conference on disability. He's serving as the president of Sambhavna Trust, DPO. Over to you, Nikhil, sir.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Thank you for inviting me on this very important day. First of all, let me wish all of you a happy World Disabled Day. Tomorrow we are celebrating, I think it is 29th International Day of Persons with Disabilities, as it started from 1992. And very special, at least for us in Delhi University also. I belong to one of the college in Delhi University, that for the first time in the history of teacher selection in DUTA, Delhi University Teachers Association, the person with visual disability have got the right of equal and independent voting in accessible format from this election. And I think on that day when the voting was happening, I met with Arun, and he invited me for this conference. He told me about this, and that is how I could know about Bhumika Trust also. So thank you very much. That day was very important for us, and
yes, sir.
Perhaps this would go a long way in ensuring the accessible and independent voting, particularly for the print disabled. And it is very important because when we talk about inclusion, as it is the theme of this international conference. So I'm basically a teacher teaching in a college, but I'm also active, playing as a disabled activism. I'm doing disability activism as a president of DPO called Sambhavna, which has been working for the rights of disabled for more than 20 years. And primarily, we've started from Delhi University, doing our politics of disability in raising issues, particularly with regard to employment in higher education and also the education. As Dr. Sanjay quite, I think, categorically talked and very realistically that, just a minute. Yeah, that higher education in India has been, I think, not only missing in terms of the policymakers' attention, it has missed the attention of policymakers, but also even in the RPD Act, it does get a very, very little space, particularly in Article 32. So there is only a mention of 5% reservation in the educational institutes in higher education. Otherwise, not much other areas are covered, but they are in a sense of a general inference. So when we talk about inclusion, I think inclusion generally is referred to as as something where the visibility is to be ensured, or where you just wish to ensure that person with disability should get involved in the mainstream, where the vantage point of the mainstreams are considered to be the only vantage point where person with disabilities are to behave in that very fashion. My understanding of inclusion is that where the equality is ensured, where the vantage point of disabled should get an equal space or equal recognition as the other vantage points. So inclusion, actually, when we really try to recognize the inclusion, there should not be a kind of there will not be a situation of mainstream or other streams. Whenever we talk about mainstream, there has to be an exclusion. So when we talk about equal participation, equal recognition, equal respect, there is bound to be inclusion. So disabled in today's understanding, participating in schools, they're going to the colleges, although in a quite like a little number, not in a substantial way, but still, if they are visible, but are they getting the kind of treatment or the facilities or access to the resources as others? This is one of the point where the policymakers have not paid, I think, attention to. So our advocacy has been in higher education, and in my understanding, since Sambhavna is one of the advocacy group, and the inclusion or disability rights has been ensured particularly in 3 ways, or can be ensured in 3 ways, apart from the fact that you negotiate with the government, or you write letters, or you have meetings, or come to some kind of a negotiation, and there are some executive orders from the government time and again, which gives some kind of a policy relaxations, or policy benefits to the person with disabilities. There have been major 3 ways from where person with disabilities or disability rights have been ensured. The first has been the disability movements. Second have been which we call that advocacy, which is the judicial interventions. Third has been, which is still not on the scene, where we lack quite badly, is that the political participation of disabled. So I'll come to the movements, and I will try to restrict myself to India only. And I find that in India, the major movements, disability movements, have been launched by persons with visual disabilities, as per my understanding, and they started from 1970s onwards, particularly in the later half of the 1970s. And 70s was a very important time in the history of persons with disabilities, where United Nations for the first time gave recognition to persons with disability by celebrating the 9th December as the disabled International Disabled Day, or International Disabled Persons Day. So, and that was the decade when many nations started recognizing disabled as one of their agenda, but that too very little way. And I came across a very interesting executive order, which I'll talk about later. In 1972, there was an executive order issued by the UP government, Uttar Pradesh government, which talks about 2% reservation for person with disabilities in those days. One cannot imagine that, where there was no law, there were no movements as such, but still there was some sense prevailing somewhere about person with disabilities. But that is not to say that government was very, very sensitive, or was fully empathetic towards person with disabilities, or it has got all kinds of understanding of it. But yes, there was somewhere something available. And in 1970s onward, I think there was a huge movement which led to the passage of 1976 executive order, where in group C and D, person with disabilities were able to get the reservation. And then I think from 1980s onwards, because internationally also, as 1981 was celebrated as the International Year for Person with Disabilities. And then we had many programs, because India was a signatory to that, so a party to that. So there were many government programs, and I recall that in 1980 or 81, there was a huge movement which led to particularly forcing governments to not only launch various programs, but to recognize disability as one of the agenda of the government, which ultimately led to the forcing government to recognize disabled to be eligible for group B and A. Particularly, it came into being only when the Person with Disabilities Act came into existence in 1995. But still, I think the movements certainly have played a very important role in at least in the areas of education as well as employment. And there, I think even disability policy, or in 2000, although after 1995, we did not witness much of the movements to be aggressively done by the disabled community, as the disability politics turned towards the advocacy, or towards the litigation, or judicial turning towards judicial support. And our organization Sambhavna, which has primarily been working towards it started from a movement, as I recall, in 2001, when we held 1 month long dharna in the Vice Chancellor's office, at least to get a 3% reservation to be realized, not only in paper but in practice, and which ultimately led to the Executive Council to pass an directive to all the colleges to at least give to implement 3% reservation in Delhi University. Anyhow, that subsequently it was to be implemented, or it was to be forced by our judicial, I think, litigation that we filed in 2006. And I think apart from that, the movements, I recall that there was a serious movements in 2013 when the rights, the RPD bill was to be passed through an ordinance. It was to be brought through an ordinance by then UPA government, and there was, I think, a very big movement. I think continued for days, which ultimately stopped government not to pass this act through an ordinance. Ultimately came into it was adopted through a parliamentary bill only in 2016. So movements certainly have played a very important role, not only enforcing government to give rights to the person with disabilities, but movements also consolidated the participation of person with disabilities, and also it has increased the consciousness of even the person with disabilities about their rights. Whether people were not aware about the schemes of the government. So movements have highlighted those issues, those lacunas, those gaps which exist between the government's framing laws or issuing executive orders and not delivering it. So whether there is a bureaucratic issue, whether the administration is not making or implementing law, or it is not reaching. So movements have highlighted those gaps, and movements also made a significant contribution by giving us our due rights in terms of the acts that we have. whether it is RCI Act, particularly whether it is Person with Disabilities Act 1995, or even National Trust Act, which was a great development, particularly to the Mental Health Act of 1987. And then certainly in terms of disability policy in 2006, and now we have the RPD Act 2016. So that was one of the major contribution in my understanding, the movements have played in our lives, and also in the disability rights politics. Now I come to the judiciary. I think judiciary has played more a progressive as well as, I would say, less progressive role. But I would rather focus upon the progressive role, because as I was talking about the 1972 executive order issued by the UP government, and that was quoted in one of the case, Dayanand Tripathi versus the Uttar Pradesh Public Service Commission, where the petitioner was asking the court to implement that very order which was issued by the UP government, where the 2% reservation was to be, it was talked about, and ultimately in a court by adhering to that, asked the respondent to implement it, and Dayanand Tripathi got the job actually in UPSC. Unfortunately, during those days, even the judiciary was not so positive, and it did not consider the person with visual disability as well as hearing impaired not fit for the UPSC, even sitting in the exams of Union Public Service Commission. And that was snatched by them in a case filed by National Federation of the Blind in, I think it was decided in 1992, when for the first time it was recognized the person with blindness to sit in the exams. So that was one of the major victory actually, that the access to the union service commissions or the administrative posts was considered to be fit for the person with visual disabilities, and there were particularly problems in after in reservations, as even after the passage of 1995 Act, where 3% reservation was given or granted, but the institutions were not giving the 3% reservation. Rather, they were writing in the advertisements that 3% reservations was applicable, but in actual practice, they were not giving it. So in one of the case, I recall in Pushkar Singh versus Delhi University and others, where it was decided by a single bench that Delhi University should adopt 3% reservation, and they had given a timeline also of 6 months, but nothing happened. And that was the time when Sambhavna came into existence quite formidably. We started organizing demonstrations, dharnas, and trying to talk with the administration about the implementation of the act, and also to honor the High Court judgment, Delhi High Court judgment. The university was very clever in that sense by saying that, yes, we are giving 3% reservation. You can see our advertisements. It is already mentioned. So what we found that though they are writing about 3% reservation, the disabled applicants also visiting they're going for the interviews, but they're denied. So what was the key behind all this? And we found that the key behind all this for normal implementation is the roster. Delhi University, I think, and many and all other universities in India, I will come to that, had not adopted the 100-point roster then. So we pointed this out in our historic case of Sambhavna versus Delhi University and others, where UGC was also made party. And we highlighted the issue of roster apart from the backlog and all. And we asked the court to direct university to provide the roster, copy of roster, which university failed. And in that context, a historic order passed by then Justice Thakur, I think on 4th April 2007, where it stopped all appointments in Delhi University until the 3% reservation was to be adopted. So that the lawyers of the Delhi University used to beg from Justice Thakur that please allow the appointment process to take place. So Justice Thakur used to tell them that please, we are not asking anything. We are asking only for 3%. You give us 3%, we'll give you rest of the 97. So that was, I think, one of the major historic days that I keep on recalling and don't wish to forget also. And today, Delhi University is the only university where more than 200 teachers, disabled teachers, are appointed. And subsequently, we also had a case for the non-teaching post where we won. And now we have a lot of non-teaching disabled persons working in different colleges as administrative officers, as different libraries, in the offices, and even in the universities. And apart from that, there were many cases filed by Sambhavna, particularly on in JNU and even in Jamia. And there is a very important case of Sunanda Bhandare versus Union of India, where it was decided in 2014, just asking UGC and universities to provide 3% reservation. But the roster issue was missing. So we have filed an intervention, and we almost have sought in rosters from all universities across India. So once this issue is settled, that if the universities are come with a roster, I think we are there to have our disabled friends to be in jobs in many of the universities, because that's where I think universities try to, try to be smart enough not to give, not to implement, or to try to escape from that implementing the now 4% reservation by not providing the roster. So our case in Delhi University not only provided the roster, but also directed University of Delhi to display the roster on the websites. And even in one of the order, significantly caused the High Court, the Honorable High Court asked those colleges who have not applying or not implementing the court's order, asking UGC to stop the grants. So this was something actually very, very unusual for the court to ask the stoppage of grants of those institutions who are not abiding by the court's order. So this is what actually the power of court, I think, in the most progressive ways that we have witnessed. Otherwise, there are many other cases where I think we may say that in Anmol Bhandari versus Delhi Technical Universities, and also Medhavi Krishnan versus Delhi University and others, where I think very significantly court has directed the respondent to provide the petitioner relief in terms of seat in the admissions. But more significantly, the court had recognized that person with disability should be treated at par with the SC and ST. And where I think we truly lack, that in many cases, the courts could not provide justice because they say that you don't enjoy the constitutional protection specifically as it is given to the SC, ST and others. So courts have said that yes, the eligibility criteria and other things should be at par with SC, ST. And in case it is required, it can go below that. So it's something I think wonderful, particularly in consolidating the disability rights movement. And one of the very important case, I think, in Sambhavna versus Delhi University, where the respondent was, they introduced a 4-year undergraduate program without giving any space to the person with disabilities, particularly without giving any consideration rather. As they had, they had 2 important courses in the first year in foundation courses, where one of the course was building mathematical ability and other was science and life. So the the contention, our petition was that these courses should be, the provision of this the 4-year undergraduate program denies the students with disabilities, particularly the print disabled, to have an equal access to these courses. The teachers are not aware how to teach the visually challenged, the mathematics, the building mathematical ability and science courses. And the university has not cared to even think on these lines, that how the students with visual disabilities could be taught in their classes in those courses, because these courses were considered to be mandatory courses, and they are to be essentially to be taught. So ultimately, in the Supreme Court, it was decided the respondent was directed to give a bridge course to, or maybe, and also to give training to the teachers to teach these courses, and the alternative methods as prescribed in the PWD first, and then now in the RPD we have the alternative methods to be provided in education, not only in terms of teaching but also in examination. So that was then there, and I recall those days when I was an academic council member, as the first disabled academic council member in DU, and for the first time I realized that the disability is not even figuring in Delhi University, even after having so many teachers in Delhi University, that not only the policymakers, the administrators of Delhi University, but even in the teaching fraternity, in the politics, the disability is not figuring as such. So those, I think, in the nutshell, there are many judicial interventions, but I would like to restrict myself to few only, and would like to say that, in the nutshell, these judicial interventions have not only realized having our rights of education, equal access to education, and also to some extent, I would say, employment, not largely, because in UPSC also we are fighting, and in 2014 we got a significant judgment where in 1 year around 54% with disabilities got appointed, because the contest was in number of seats. The UPSC was not giving as much seats as it was due to person with disabilities in terms of reservation, 3% reservation. So, but still, I think there is a lot to cover, a lot to travel in this area, and it's very challenging to fight the UPSC particularly, because they still are resisting in terms of not giving the due share to person with disabilities. But I'm optimistic that one day it will be gained. So the movements and judiciary certainly have played. But last, I think the point which I made, the third important thing through which I believe the disabled could get their rights is political participation, where we are lacking quite frantically, I think quite badly. And not talking about the central, government, like parliament or state legislatures, even in the institutions, the political participation of disabled is minimal. And it is important because decision-making process is one where all policies are made or they are determined. And absence of person with disability in the decision-making process, is the reason why the policies are discriminatory, why the policies are not adequate, and why policies are not being implemented in a right manner. And that's what I realized when I contested for the first time as an academic council member in Delhi University in 2008, that the people at the teaching fraternity there were not accepting, they were finding it very hard to accept that the disability is one of the vantage point of politics in Delhi University. So they were talking in terms of gender, they're talking in terms of Dalits' rights or caste, they're talking about the Hindi medium versus English medium, they're talking about the semester and other things, but disability was certainly not at all visible. And once after getting elected in 2010 and then 2013, I realized that the policies are, I think, very discriminatory, not because the people are not so sensitive, but largely because there is no disabled person there, at least to suggest at the time of policy framing that how to prepare, how to include, or how to push the disability perspective in the policies. And I recall that Delhi University became the first university in the whole country to pass and adopt the exam writing policy in 2011. And particularly when I insisted and I think pushed Vice Chancellor to adopt it, because we already framed an exam writing policy. And that was one of the, I think, in my understanding, the most progressive exam writing policy for the print disabled. Subsequently, the exam writings policies came at the national level, but some of the clauses are diluted. If I get in time or I get a chance, I would share with you the original draft of Delhi University's exam writing policy, which was covering many of the areas, and it was covering almost all kinds of disabilities who face difficulty in writing their exams, and now who are included in RPD Act. So in those times, it happened only because there was one disabled person there in academic council, and even in the colleges, we find very few people, in different crucial committees like finance committees, like admission committee, like timetable committee, and many other committees. And even when I became the Secretary of Staff Council, I came to know that even today there was no person being accepted as the secretary to play a role of Secretary of Staff Council. And there's nothing to be done, as Dr. Sanjay was saying, that why particularly blind people are debarred from or not accepted to play an administrative role, because their vantage point of administration is only seeing that only a person who could see has the right or has the capability of playing an administrative role. So that was one of the major attitudinal barrier which requires to be challenged, and it will happen only when many people like Dr. Sanjay Singh and many others who could play, who are playing, and they will play an effective role, and they will show the others that how those administrative posts are to be handled. So in my understanding, disability rights has traveled in India substantially. It has covered areas, it has covered, and movements, and judiciary has played there a bit in terms of consolidating disability rights and politics. But there is much to cover, there's much to travel. And with this, I thank the organizers for inviting me, and also the audience to listening me patiently. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nikhil sir, for your comprehensive speech. It was really inspirational and thought-provoking. I now invite questions from our audience. You can please frame your questions and send it in the chat box. I'll then pose it to the respected speakers. So am I audible?
Yeah, you are, sir. But someone has to interpret the questions, like someone has to speak the questions if they are in the chat box.
Yes, sir.
Or else the audience can unmute themselves and speak it directly if they are hesitation in the chat box.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Anyone wants to ask anything? I think JNG, we should to move.
Okay, then Aman, you may proceed further then, because I don't think anyone has the more questions, because the speakers have like explained in such a manner, so they don't have any doubts in their minds now.
Yes, sir. So we shall. I think someone raised their hand. Right,
yeah, Shampa.
Yeah, Miss Sampa. Unmute yourself. Okay.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, yes, you're audible. Please ask your question.
Yes, sir. Actually, my question is, you were talking about movement. So in order to get those rights or acquire those rights, we need to uh, do those movements and all. So when we are thinking about some institution, and in those institutions, some rights are there which we need to be acquired, and in order to that, we are making these kind of movements. But after all, even we are kind of achieving our rights to that particular issue, but after that we have to stay in those institutions, and there we will face, after that, after everything is done, after that we will face some kind of, you can say, discrimination or certain kind of behavioral problem from the others, from the authority, you can say, or something like that. So in this situation, it's very difficult to kind of maintain your professional life in that sense, after if we make certain kind of movements against the authority or something. So in these situations, what should be done according to you, sir, in order to overcome this kind of situation?
Well, I think this is pointed to me, right? As I could get it.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think when we are talking about dignity or dignified life, or we are talking about the rights, we certainly are not talking about charity, right? And movements are one which have, which have attracted our attention as disabled, as well as the other society, the civil society, towards the dignified life of a person with disability, or the rights which are to be attained. And the movements are launched only when there is a discrimination. And movements are launched only when there is a denial of something, which you are entitled for, which there is a constitutional or legal provision, and where there is a provision even as a human. So that is up to you. Like if I give an example, in 1992, there was a constitutional provision, 73rd Amendment Act, where there was a very radical, I think revolutionary thing happened, that women in panchayats got 33% reservation. Now, this was very hard to imagine. Rural areas, the one where women, they were hardly, they were educated, they didn't have any sense at all. They were domesticated largely, okay? And I'm telling you because I have done my research on that. And there were many women who were challenging as exercising their right of being panch or sarpanch, their male counterparts. Now, those were the women who had to stay with their husbands and, father-in-law or brother-in-law or whatever. And if those women are expected to just sit and be a mute spectator, okay, that yes, they have to live in harmony in the family and let our husbands or father-in-laws or brother-in-laws or whatever do whatever they wish to do. So do you think that constitutional provision could be implementable? It is not. And similarly, that is what we have to understand, that movements at least tell not only us our place in the society. The people where, like, our employer is not giving any sort of a, it's not obliging us by giving our rights. It is our constitutional entitlement. It's our legal entitlement. So at least I think we should take that fear away out, and only when it is when it happens, then would I think the fruits of the movements could be reaped, because the participation of people like many of us who fear about the further discrimination or maybe vindictive attitude of the owners or the employers, which certainly will come. But it is you to decide actually that whether you have to come out a feature and take your rights, or you'll have to be kept obliged by the institution. Otherwise, what will happen? That the employer or the person or the family member will do whatever he or she wants you to behave in. So in that sense, I think rights cannot be accrued, rights cannot be taken. And disability politics or disability rights movement have shown us this path only, that our rights can be taken only when we quite boldly stand against the discriminator, whether whatever may be the the aftermath or maybe the result of this. This has to be done, and this fear needs to be, I think, out of your mind. And this is one of the attitudinal barrier in us also, that very fear. We are talking about the attitudinal barrier of society. This is all one of the attitudinal barrier which we have, that that we keep in ourselves, and that is why we are not able to participate, and that's how a state is able to to behave in a dictatorial way as it is unfortunately doing. So anyway, I think it makes some sense to you.
नमस्ते सर, दिस इज शरद त्रिपाठी फ्रॉम जयपुर।
जी नमस्ते
जी, तो मैं अपनी बात हिंदी में रखना चाहूंगा, यदि आप सभी कोई तकलीफ ना हो तो। सर, आपकी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का जो कार्य है या जो आप काम कर रहे हैं संभावना के माध्यम से, वो निश्चित रूप से सराहनीय है। और मैं भी एक विजुअली चैलेंज पर्सन हूँ जयपुर से, और जयपुर में हमने हमारे संगठन ने या डीपीओ ने बहुत लंबे समय तक मूवमेंट्स किए, और वो सारी चीजें हम लोग करते रहे। 2016 में लास्ट राजस्थान में एक बड़ा प्रोटेस्ट हुआ था, जिसको मैं बीइंग अ गवर्नमेंट एम्प्लॉय होते हुए बाहर से सपोर्ट कर रहा था, लेकिन फिर भी रोड ब्लॉकेज और इस तरह के मामलों में कुछ केसेस मेरे अगेंस्ट फाइल किए गए, सभी के अगेंस्ट, मतलब उसमें मेरा नाम भी चार्जशीट में डाल दिया गया था। लेकिन इसके बारे में ना तो एम्प्लॉयर और ना ही मुझे कोई नोटिस मिला। और हुआ ये कि जब मैंने एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को और चेंज किया, मैं दूसरी गवर्नमेंट सर्विस में गया, तो अभी प्रोबेशन पीरियड पूरा होने के बाद मेरी सर्विसेज को टर्मिनेट कर दिया गया विंडिक्टिवली, जो आप बात कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि मैं डिपार्टमेंट के अंदर भी एक्सेसिबिलिटी को लेकर और उन सारे इश्यूज को लेकर लगातार लिख रहा था हमारे डायरेक्टर जनरल को और उस सारी चीजों को लेकर। अभी मैं सर्विस टर्मिनेट होने के बाद लगभग 6 महीने से मैं लगातार प्रयास कर रहा हूँ, अपील कर रहा हूँ ऑनरेबल मिनिस्टर को कि वो डीजी के ऑर्डर को टर्न डाउन करें, मुझे वापस रीइंस्टेट करें। तो जो आपने बात बोली ना कि हमें स्ट्रगल करना होगा, हमें लड़ना होगा, तो अब होता ही है ना कि ऐसी सिचुएशंस में परिवार जो है ना, वो आपके पीछे आपको बोलता है कि भाई आपने क्या पाया, या ये इतना सब कुछ करने के बाद या सब कुछ हो रहा है। दूसरी बात जो आपने बोली कि पॉलिटिकल रिप्रेजेंटेशन को लेकर जो आपने बात बोली, राजस्थान में एक बहुत अच्छा डिसीजन हुआ है पिछले दिनों कि शहरी निकायों में, यानी कि जो काउंसिल्स हैं शहर की, उसमें जो नॉमिनेशन होता है मेंबर्स का, उसमें से वन ऑफ द मेंबर्स को ऑन प्रायोरिटी बेसिस पर्सन विद डिसेबिलिटी होगा, और ये राजस्थान गवर्नमेंट ने किया लास्ट ईयर, इसके ऑर्डर्स किए थे, और अभी इस साल उसका इम्प्लीमेंटेशन भी शुरू हो गया, और लगभग 200 से ज्यादा पर्सन विद डिसेबिलिटीज को नगर निकायों में एज अ मेंबर नॉमिनेट किया गया है गवर्नमेंट के द्वारा। और अभी बड़े शहरों की जो कॉर्पोरेशन है उनका प्रोसेस भी अंडर प्रोसेस है, जल्दी ही उसके ऑर्डर्स भी आ जाएंगे। तो अभी हम लोग सरकार से नेगोशिएट कर रहे हैं कि जब वो शहरों में उन्होंने कर दिया है तो ग्रामीण में क्यों नहीं कर रहे हैं। तो हो सकता है कि जल्दी ही हम ग्राम पंचायतों में भी पर्सन विद डिसेबिलिटीज को या जिला परिषद लेवल पर एज अ मेंबर ऑफ नॉमिनेटेड मेंबर देख पाएंगे। तो ये हम राजस्थान में कर पाए हैं एज अ होल, हमारा जो संगठन है, या जिसमें और भी लोग स्टेक होल्डर्स हैं, सब लोग मिलके। लेकिन बहुत सारे लॉसेस भी हमने फेस करने पड़े। जैसे पर्सनली मैं एक लॉस फेस कर पा रहा हूँ कि मेरी नौकरी ले ली गई नेहरू युवा केंद्र जिसमें मैं सर्विस करता था, और दिल्ली में चूंकि इतना डिफिकल्ट हो जाता है, तो हम लोग मैं व्यक्तिगत रूप से आपकी मदद भी चाहूंगा कि दिल्ली में एडवोकेसी करने के लिए मेरे केस को लेकर भी मुझे सपोर्ट मिले, तो ऐसा भी मैं चाहता हूँ। थैंक यू।
धन्यवाद। मैं भी आपसे हिंदी में ही बात करना चाहूंगा, और अच्छा हुआ आपने हिंदी में बोला। मैं 2-4 मिनट बोल सकता हूँ? ऑर्गेनाइजेशन से पूछ रहा हूँ।
यस सर, प्लीज।
थैंक यू जी। ओके, तो आपने पहला जो पॉइंट उठाया वो ठीक बात है कि, और ये रिफ्लेक्शन है उस विंडिक्टिव एटीट्यूड का जिसमें हम बात अभी कर रहे थे इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में। और ये भी सही बात है कि फैमिली प्रेशर रहेगा। मैं आपको अपना उदाहरण दे सकता हूँ कि जब मैं पिटिशनर बना था दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी के, मैं आई वाज द मेन पिटिशनर, और पूरी यूनिवर्सिटी में हलचल थी क्योंकि सबके अपॉइंटमेंट रुक गए थे। आप समझ सकते हैं कि सारी लॉबीज जो थी वो अगेंस्ट थी हमारे, है ना, और इतना प्रेशर था। पर ये प्रेशर हैंडल नहीं करते तो आज हम यहाँ नहीं पहुंचते। और जब हम 2013 में, मुझे याद है कि सुप्रीम कोर्ट में गए, हाई कोर्ट में, और उस समय आई वाज एसी मेंबर, तो एसी की सभा में और बाहर ऐसा लगता था जैसे पूरा एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन खाने को दौड़ रहा है, इतनी बुरी हालत होती थी। अकेला ऐसा लगता, अकेला मैं, एक ब्लाइंड पर्सन अकेला, मैं हालांकि ये बात नहीं कभी शेयर करता हूँ, ये करता हूँ कि एक अकेला ब्लाइंड पर्सन और वो पूरी सभा में बैठा है, उसको वॉशरूम भी जाना है, उसको खाना भी खाना है, उसको हर चीज करनी है, और अपनी बात भी रखनी है, और अपने आप को सेव भी करना है, बाहर भी रखना है। उसके बाद हमें अपने मेंटल फैक्ट उसको बना के रखना है कि भाई हम जिस पॉलिटिक्स को लेकर आए हैं उसे चूकना नहीं है ना, इन ऑल बेस्ट पॉसिबल वे। तो ये स्थिति तो रहती है, लेकिन क्या है कि अगर ये स्थिति नहीं रहेगी तो हम चैलेंज नहीं कर पाएंगे। बाकी आपका जो है वो तो मुझे लगता है कि आराम से वो स्टे हो सकता है उस पर। मुझे डिटेल नहीं पता, कभी आप मेरा नंबर ले लीजिएगा इनसे, ऑर्गेनाइजर से, और आप बात कर लीजिएगा। हमारे लिए जो संभव होगा, हमारे लिए बहुत खुशी होगी कि हम आपकी मदद कर पाए, और ये जो भी डिनायल है तो बुरा है, और इसके खिलाफ स्टे तो मिल जाएगा आराम से हाई कोर्ट में, कोई दिक्कत नहीं होने वाली। क्योंकि अगर कोई टेक्निकल ग्राउंड है नहीं, कोई चाहे टेक्निकल ग्राउंड भी हो तब भी मतलब इनफैक्ट आरपीडी एक्ट तो अब सेव करता ही है, चाहे किसी को डिसेबिलिटी इवन ड्यूरिंग द जॉब भी हो जाती है। तो ये तो कोई रीजन नहीं बनता है अनलेस अनटिल कोई किसी प्रकार का कोई ट्रीजन है, फेक डॉक्यूमेंट्स हैं, ये कोई ऐसा चीज है जिसमें कोई फॉल्ट है, अदरवाइज कोई रीजन नहीं बनता है किसी को जॉब से निकालने का। तो विल सर्टनली हेल्प यू, नो इश्यूज एट ऑल। हमारी जो भी क्षमताएं होंगी उससे आपकी पूरी मदद हम कर पाएंगे। और इसलिए बस मैं इतना कहना चाहता हूँ, देखिए मैं ये नहीं कह रहा हूँ कि बहुत आइडियल तरीके से हर चीज अचीव हो जाएगी, और हर एक की क्षमताएं, हर एक की परिस्थितियां भिन्न होती हैं, मेरी अलग हैं, आपकी अलग होंगी, लेकिन हम कोशिश करें कि अपनी जो भी व्याप्त परिस्थितियां हैं, जो भी हमारी एग्जिस्टिंग रियलिटीज हैं, उनके साथ हम जितना स्ट्रगल कर पाए। क्योंकि देखिए राइट्स तो तभी मिलेंगे जब स्ट्रगल, ये तो रियलिटी है, आपको थाली में सजा के शायद ना मिल पाए, बहुत ही किस्मत वाले होते हैं जिनके थाली में सज के चीजें मिलती हैं, तो वो तभी मिल पाएंगी जब आप स्ट्रगल के लिए तैयार हो पाए, और ये फायदेमंद है क्योंकि तब आप उन राइट्स को वैल्यू भी कर पाएंगे। थैंक यू।
Thank you so much, Nikhil sir. Do we have any more questions?
I don't think so, Aman. Do we have any more questions? We can.
Yes, sir. You and I. Yes, sir. So I'll invite Suchita ma'am for a vote of thanks. She is the assistant professor at Departmental of Economics, Hansraj College. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. You are audible.
Okay. So first of all, a very good evening to all of you. On behalf of Equal Opportunity Cell and Enabling Unit of Hansraj College, Bhumika Trust, and Center for Disability Studies, Gujarat National Law University, I sincerely thank all our esteemed speakers, Dr. Sanjay Jain, Ms. Sudamini Peter, Ms. Rama Krishnamachari, and Dr. Nikhil Jain for taking our time from their busy schedules and sharing their thoughtful insights and wisdom with us. It was truly inspiring and thought-provoking, and I'm pretty sure that it must have generated a great deal of interest among all our participants, particularly our young students. We therefore hope and look forward to hear you again in future. I also take this opportunity to thank the entire team for not only organizing, but so very efficiently conducting the entire proceedings. Last but not the least, I am thankful to all the participants for their active engagements and for their inputs. Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you very much, all of you.
Yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you so much.
It was wonderful interacting with you all.
Damni ma'am is also saying thanks to everyone.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Preeti ji. Thank you, Atul ji.
Thank you, Preeti ma'am and Atul. Thank you so much.